Welcome and thank you all for being here. It's just incredible to see the turnout that we have for this event. We've still got more people signing on. I'm Stacy Mitchell. I'm the co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which is a national nonprofit that works to reverse concentrated corporate power and strengthen local communities and local economies. I direct the organization's Independent Business Initiative, which produces research and works alongside others to advocate for policies to create a level playing field for independent small businesses. And as part of that work, we have been very pleased to partner with the American Economic Liberties Project on the Protect Our Restaurants campaign. And I want to thank Economic Liberties for their incredibly hard work on this issue and also for organizing today's event. We are very honored to be joined today by Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon. She represents Pennsylvania's 5th District and is the Vice Chair of the House Judiciary Committee. She's also part of its Antitrust Subcommittee, which yesterday released an incredibly important and historic investigation of monopoly power of the tech giants. That report came out yesterday, and she's been a critical part of, a really pivotal part of that investigation and the committee's important findings about how we address monopoly power in the tech sector. Congresswoman Scanlon has also been a leader on market power abuses of the dominant restaurant delivery apps, which is why she's here today. She joined with Congresswoman Jayapal and Congresswoman Schakowsky to send a letter to the FTC calling for it to investigate dominant delivery apps for their deceptive and exploitive practices. So the format for today's event is that the Congresswoman is going to offer a few opening remarks, and then she and I will have a short Q&A exchange. After that, we'll turn to a panel of leaders of independent restaurants and restaurant organizations. That panel is going to be moderated by Sarah Miller, the Executive Director of the American Economic Liberties Project. And so with that, I want to once again welcome you, Congresswoman Scanlon, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this conversation. You know, the Philadelphia region is home to a vibrant and really dynamic restaurant organization. In the 35 years that I've lived in the region, you know, it's gone from being a restaurant desert to one of the most innovative and really wonderful spots for emerging restaurants, new cuisine. We hear a lot about independent restaurateurs preferring Philadelphia to New York because they get to actually execute their craft here, whereas in New York, up until recently at least, the metrics were always all about money and having to make the rent. So Philadelphia is more affordable and they're able to really pursue their passions. And I am more than happy to help them pursue those passions because my family likes food. So, you know, we have amazing restaurants here, and the restaurant scene has been a defining characteristic of the city's culture over the last couple decades. Unfortunately, obviously, the coronavirus has had an outsized impact on that industry. In Philadelphia, I think our restaurant sales, I've got statistics here that say that restaurant sales are down 50% and that 40% of restaurant workers have been laid off. I think that's undercounting. I think those may be old statistics because we've certainly seen closures. We've seen, you know, the restrictions that were in place until just recently on in-person dining, obviously taking a huge bite out of everyone's ability to function. And so obviously restaurants have had to rely on delivery and takeout, and the market for those services has been controlled by 3 large platforms, DoorDash, Grubhub, and Uber. And we started, I had a conversation a couple months back with Restaurant Association, and they were talking about the high fees and the deceptive practices. And, you know, the challenge in Congress is always, okay, what can I do about this? But having been engaged in these conversations on the Antitrust Committee about the competition suppression tactics of these large internet platforms, it fit right into that work. And we were able to identify, okay, this is something we need to look at. So it led us to join with Economic Liberties and then Representatives Jayapal and Schakowsky to send a letter to the FTC asking the FTC to dig into this further as we proceed with trying to look at what we need to do to drag some of our antitrust regulations into the 21st century. So we highlighted the problems we were hearing from restaurants and asked for action on the increasingly concentrated market for food delivery services. With Uber's acquisition of Postmates, I think there's only 3 main firms right now. And in each of the major cities, one of the firms controls 50% or more of the food delivery services. So if you're a restaurant owner who's struggling with economic downturn and trying to increase takeout options, you can either do your own marketing and delivery, which obviously has costs in terms of personnel and just bandwidth, or you can sign up for the area's dominant platform. And so we've seen high fees and poor service, which makes it even more difficult for participating restaurants to survive. So, we're going to be pressing the FTC to move forward with investigations in this area. They have the tools to do it. Although, what we've been dealing with on the committee is the fact that the FTC and the Justice Department have been too deferential to corporate interests, in part because of the way the case law has gone in the courts. So, it appears to be yet another area where we have to focus on rising concentration, which it's impacting restaurants, it's impacting healthcare, it's impacting tech. And so we're going to, keep working on this at the committee level as well. You mentioned that our big report came out yesterday, where we've been investigating concentration in digital markets. And we're going to be moving forward on recommendations on how we can reform our antitrust laws to really address these modern challenges. So, we looked a lot at how big tech has used market power and integrated services to stifle innovation and kill competition, and soak the American public ultimately. So that gives us the wedge to try to work with. So we know status quo isn't the way to go. We were disappointed that as this report came out, it's been a bipartisan effort throughout, but at the last minute, the ranking member, Jim Jordan from Ohio, decided not to join in the report and has been urging the GOP members of the committee to dissent from the report. So we're disappointed that that last minute monkey wrench has been thrown in it for among the reasons he cites as stifling of conservative speech. My argument would be stifling of untruthful speech, which is not necessarily the same thing as conservative speech, but that's for another day. But at any rate, we want to make sure that the platforms are working to benefit consumers and the restaurant industry. As a side note, there's also Representative Blumenauer from Oregon has introduced the Restaurants Act, which is designed to provide relief to restaurants in the form of stabilization grants that would pay eligible payroll and help provide funds to keep restaurants afloat through this period when, for safety reasons, they may find their other operations limited. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you and we can have a conversation.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for those opening remarks. I think one of the things that's been really striking in digging into this issue and talking more and more to restaurants is you've got the high fees, which can be 30% or more by the time you add everything up, and just an extraordinary cut. I mean, in effect, I think that means that these delivery apps are maybe taking more from the restaurants than the people who work there, and the owners are actually earning from all of their labor.
I don't know any restaurant that has a 30% profit margin.
Yes, and even if you roll in payroll, you're maybe barely hitting 30%. So it's an extraordinary cut for what these delivery services provide. But then what's been so striking is the fraud, essentially. There's fake menus and creating phone numbers that route customers through the delivery apps and when they think that they're dialing directly into the restaurant. And there are a bunch of these tactics. And I was wondering if you could just comment on, how do we, there's a sort of rampant lawlessness on the part of powerful companies, not only in this sector, but elsewhere. And it seems like the FTC and other agencies that are supposed to be the cop on the beat aren't doing their job. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what we do about that and how we popularize the importance of that action.
Right, and that is one of the things, you know, it's kind of related to the investigations we've been doing with respect to the large platforms and how they really use their dominant position to, you know, just control the marketplace, sometimes in unfair ways. I got to ask about Amazon's work in putting out of business diapers.com, which a lot of young families were relying upon because they had really cheap diapers. And as you know, a young parent, you go through a lot of them. But so Amazon just invested millions of dollars in undercutting their prices in order to basically put diapers.com out of business. And then once it happened, it jacked up the prices. So, you know, similar but not quite the same thing where we have our delivery services, you know, that just have this position of power, and they're using predatory practices, including dishonest information to push forward. So, you know, we're going to be pushing on reforms that are going to try to give the FTC more power and more incentive to do these kinds of investigations, because as I mentioned at the outset, we've seen that they just have not been particularly energized to do this kind of thing. So we're hopeful that with a more engaged administration, we might be able to push some of that forward.
Mm-hmm. Have they responded to your letter yet?
Not yet, not yet. Getting responses from this administration is extremely difficult. And it generally, you know, bureaucracy, it takes a while, but we haven't gotten a response yet, but we will be following up regularly to press the issue.
Mm-hmm. It's good to hear.
And we've been really heartened by the response we saw in the press. I mean, clearly it struck a nerve. And we've seen a lot of articles about it. It's something that people can relate to, where, you know, often that was why I asked about diapers when we had our hearing, because it's hard to make antitrust law digestible for the average person, but people can understand pretty readily. So I think it's an issue that it's going to be easier to push forward with, because everybody's getting takeout now if they're patronizing their favorite restaurants. And I suspect we'll see that ramping up again throughout the winter.
It's great. I loved it. The hearing in July with the tech CEOs, you and other committee members used language that was not from antitrust law, but describe the concepts in real terms, like spying and bullying and stealing. And I think the committee has just done an incredible job to engage the public in understanding what these issues are in terms that are really quite clear to grasp. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about was, it seems like there is new attention to, you know, partly with COVID, and I think also around monopoly power, there seems like there's new attention to small business, you know, including among Democrats. And I'm curious if you're seeing that momentum as well, if you feel that there is more concern about the state of small business there used to be. And I also wonder if you could comment on how much of a difference it makes when small businesses engage in advocacy and reach out to their lawmakers. I mean, I think it's, you know, many people sort of assume that, you know, the big lobbying outfits have a lot of sway, and what can I do?
Well, I do think that COVID, to the extent that it has, you know, forced people to slow down a little bit, forced members of Congress and other legislators to change their ways of engaging with the public, has been really helpful for those who are willing to hear from constituents more readily. You know, the Zoom meetings allow us to gather in a way that, you know, often physical distance and such can make it more difficult. DC used to have this endless round of kind of big lobbyist events that would squeeze out, I think, smaller businesses. So I think it is probably a little bit easier right now to get the ear of folks who maybe, you know, weren't so engaged before. You know, there's been an awful lot of emphasis, at least among the Democratic caucus, in having town halls and listening to constituents, because there's been a contrast. We had a number of years where the majority party was the Republican Party, and they were getting hammered at town halls, so they stopped holding them. So, you know, some of it is governing styles, some of it I think is the circumstances, but I always find it incredibly helpful to hear concrete stories from people. You know, this is what the impact is in my community, because then you can take that story and you can take it and tell your colleagues in Congress, or you can, you know, use it to do a letter or do other advocacy. So I think that's really helpful. I mean, obviously the most helpful is if, as that restaurant association came to us and said, here's the problem and we think there's a federal angle. I mean, if you're that far down the road, it's great because it makes it a lot easier for staff that are stretched and dealing with the whole portfolio of issues. You know, if you can kind of point us in the right direction, obviously that's really, really helpful. But having those concrete examples and tying it to people in the community, among the constituents, that's like a home run in terms of getting attention and then helping your representative go out and advocate for it.
That's great. And my last question is about the big tech investigation. So you released this huge report yesterday with a lot of evidence, very detailed explanations of market power problems with Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. And then a set of policy proposals, some of which would, you know, potentially impact the restaurant delivery apps and other, you know, other market power problems outside of the big four tech giants. So what happens next? How, you know, you've now released this big investigation. What can we expect in the coming weeks and months?
Well, the hearing we had last week was about, okay, how do we actually go about implementing this? So it's kind of breaking it down into what legislatively can happen. So it's going to be drafting the legislation, and oh my gosh, the team that has worked on this, absolutely brilliant. Very far in the weeds, which is great. A lot of folks who are former Department of Justice folks, and certainly getting lots of advice from people who are really in the weeds there. You know, some of it is going to be pretty straightforward, looking at court decisions that have impeded enforcement and overruling those court decisions with legislative activity. That's kind of a basic one that hasn't been happening lately. We have to give a lot of credit to David Cicilline, who's the chair of the subcommittee, and really just seized upon this and has really run with it. Now, in terms of speed of action, you know, I suspect there's not going to be a lot happening between now and the end of the year. We don't have legislative sessions scheduled until after the election, and then we're in lame duck period. So a lot will depend upon how the election goes. We are on 24 hours notice to go back if there's any kind of relief in terms of COVID relief. And, you know, we're still holding out hope for that, although there were some conflicting tweets last night about where that's going. So, you know, a little unclear where that's headed. I think there was pretty much a universal expectation in Washington that something would have to move by year's end because the economic distress in the country is just so high. But what it looks like is still very much open to speculation. So we'll see about that. But I would hope that in the new Congress, as I said, with a more willing White House, knock on wood, and potentially a more willing Senate as well, that there would be a lot of action that benefits consumers and small businesses.
I know I said it was my last question, but if we do have a new administration and new Congress and maybe a new Senate, that anti-monopoly should be a priority?
I think there's a lot of issues that people are eager to look at with respect to these big platforms, privacy, you know, gouging practices, that kind of thing. I think they will be very much top of mind, especially given the recession that we're in. We can't afford those kind of practices. You know, if we ever could, it's even more of a problem now. And we know that, you know, small businesses, local businesses are economic engines. So we need to make sure that they're not getting squeezed out.
Well, thank you so much for all of your work on these issues, and for being with us today. It was really valuable to hear your insights on monopoly power and the delivery apps. And I think with that, thank you, and we can turn things over to our panel.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Stacy. Hello, panelists. Excuse me, I'm a little bit hoarse this morning. A lot of celebrating last night. And thank you so much, Congresswoman, for joining us. I have to tell you, it's just been incredible to see the work that your subcommittee has done. And, the report yesterday, I think, was both incredibly substantive and forward-reaching, and also just like plain common sense in a lot of cases too. And just what a remarkable achievement. And we look forward to hopefully being able to make some meaningful dents in the recommendations that you all put out in the next legislative term. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today, and hopefully we will see you soon.
Okay, well, thank you. I enjoyed it, and please keep in touch with my office as things arise, because as I said, it's really helpful to hear from folks who are looking at these issues up close and personal and can help us navigate. So,
fantastic. And that is also a great transition to our panel today. I'm really, really pleased to be able to bring this group of leaders together who are working all across the country, who are entrepreneurs, who run restaurants, who try to fight for a fair and competitive industry, and who have been on the ground working on this particular fight for, in many cases, a long time. I'm Sarah Miller. I'm the executive director of the American Economic Liberties Project. We work to push policymakers to confront monopoly of power in tech and beyond, and to reinvigorate antitrust laws and competition policy. So yesterday was a big day for us. We're so grateful to have a little bit of time from Congresswoman Scanlon, and also to be able to talk about another dimension of the anti-monopoly fight that is very salient today, which is delivery apps. Delivery apps that have taken a page from the practices and business model of tech corporations like Google and Amazon, and exploited this pandemic to really basically kind of steal and bully businesses all around the country. And what we're seeing are a lot of folks on the ground fighting back. And so let me just introduce the panelists that have joined us today. We have Katie Connors. Katie Connors is an advisory board chair of the Independent Restaurant Alliance of Oregon. She runs operations at Hat Yai, which is an Asian fusion restaurant with 2 locations in Portland. And after the COVID-19 shutdowns, she also began organizing in Portland and more broadly in Oregon for fee caps that have passed there. We have Kristen Coral. She's the co-founder of Talkatarian, which has 2 locations in Vegas, which sounds amazing. Both of her restaurants used delivery apps prior to the pandemic, but as many others did as well, became more reliant upon them post-pandemic. And she spearheaded the campaign to cap commission fees in Vegas, and was among the first to notice there that her Grubhub bill wasn't decreasing and they were flouting the law. So she's been a leader in Vegas. We have Andrew Riggy, who's the executive director of the New York Hospitality Alliance, representing restaurants and bars all over the 5 boroughs. They have led the fight against bogus fees and other questionable business practices by the likes of Grubhub and other third-party delivery companies. And then last but certainly not least, we have Colin Wallace. Colin is the former head of innovation at Grubhub. He's listed on multiple Grubhub patents. He started off as an entrepreneur. He developed a company called Fango while he was in college that later sold to Grubhub in 2011 before going to work there himself, and has been a major critic of the business practices of the delivery app platforms. So I'm really excited to have all of you join. Thank you so much. I know how busy you all are fighting these fights on the ground, a lot of cases, keeping your own businesses open and dealing with this pandemic, and also representing other businesses. So I want to start quickly by just asking a couple of questions, and then I'd also really welcome, we have a really nice sized audience today. There's a lot of interest in antitrust, so I really welcome folks to drop questions in the chat too. So let me start with Colin, if I can. Colin, so you back in 2011 sold to Grubhub, and you also, when you left, went to business school and spoke with folks at DoorDash, and they basically told you this industry is wrapped up. Don't think about it. So you have been kind of observing, watching this space for a long time, even comparing it to predatory lending in the way that it exploits restaurants. So can you give a little bit of flavor, especially for those of us that are sitting in Washington or working on policy, but would really kind of, I think, benefit from hearing all of your stories about how this is impacting businesses on the ground, and kind of walk us through what you mean when you talk about these delivery apps taking a page from predatory lending.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad to see everybody, coalescing around the cause of making sure that we restore some of the power back to restaurants. As you might have alluded to, the company I run now, actually, Zero Storefront, we actually provide this sort of customer acquisition and retention platform that's purpose built for restaurants, exactly to solve this problem. And so it's definitely something that's dear to my heart, dear to our team. My co-founder, in fact, actually ran restaurant-facing technology at Grubhub. We've been together for 12 years, so we're very familiar with the problem. To your point, we've had the good fortune and the bad fortune of being involved in this industry for a really long time. Many of the sort of vestiges of it were things that we created and that we didn't really fully understand the impact of. Examples would be, when you get an order via a tablet, and that thing starts, blinging. So we actually created that technology when I was in college. And we didn't think that it was going to be something that would be a wall of tablets one day. And in fact, as you alluded to, when I got to business school, the team that created DoorDash was 1 year ahead of me in business school. And so we had a bunch of talks about, when they were first getting this project started, it was called Palo Alto Delivery Service.com. And, my feedback was, well, I don't think this is going to be a sustainable business. Like, Grubhub's got so much of this stitched up. I was still, shareholder rep on the board for Grubhub. So I kind of knew what was going on with the different acquisitions with Seamless and merger there. And the other piece was that, DoorDash was trying to expand in these like second tier markets, like, suburbia and so on. And from our analysis at Grubhub, you could tell those places weren't going to be profitable. And what I didn't understand, though, was sort of post 2008 crash, cost of capital was really, really cheap. There was so much money that was basically looking for a place to go and get decent returns that everything was investable, and the checks were way bigger than they had ever been. Even if you look at Grubhub today, the total capital raise is $300-400 million, whereas DoorDash I think raised about $2.5 billion, and UberEats, as part of the Uber conglomerate, is around $25 billion. And so what that's enabled a lot of these platforms to do is basically fund this war where there's no need to actually turn a profit in the short term, right? Which inherently puts most restaurants at a pretty competitive disadvantage, right? You don't have $2 billion to burn in order to run your business. And so that's a real challenge. And I think, the last piece that I'll mention is, I think we have a lot of the provisions in place to be able to fight this war. I think there's one or two places where we're not taking full advantage of it. Examples are like mandatory arbitration clauses for, contractors, right? Where if contractors were actually able to bring class action lawsuits, a lot of this stuff wouldn't even exist, right? Because we have mechanisms where, there's sort of a major slap on the wrist that would regulate it. So, I'd love to see more of those types of things, right? Where just small changes in how we allow these companies to operate will kind of restore some of the balance. And then some of the stuff that, we do, trying to use technology as a lever to help restaurants reclaim their data, reclaim their customers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a systemic problem in terms of having basically like unlimited Wall Street cash to burn as you work towards achieving monopoly power, and how that warps and distorts markets and puts smaller competitors at a major and oftentimes insurmountable disadvantage. It's way that Amazon has also achieved its market dominance, infinite capital to burn through.
Yeah, I was just going to say too, like, it's not new, right? I mean, 2001, Walmart was trying to enter into, Minnesota and into Maryland, and their strategy was to price gasoline below market. And, the FTC came in, the legislators came in and said, wait, that's not fair. You can't, sell this at a loss in order to kill all the other competitors and then, capitalize on the return. So it's not new rules. It's just not being refereed right now. I think the regulators kind of aren't, at the wheel.
Yeah, I think that's been an understatement. And just to note, a bill has been passed out of the committee that would ban, I think, forced arbitration, and that was a recommendation in the report yesterday, and predatory pricing was as well. So I think with the recommendations that are now, kind of at the core of sort of the democratic set of positions on this piece, we're seeing some of those major structural disadvantages elevated and a big part of the conversation. So thanks so much. Let me turn to Andrew. Andrew, you've been kind of fighting Grubhub in New York City for a very long time. You started out, I think, as at your family's third generation bakery in Queens, and now are kind of helping to oversee and lead the entire kind of restaurant and bar industry in New York. Just remarkable, especially at a time like this. But you've been watching Grubhub for a very long time. And I think something that always really kind of shocks people is when they actually learn about the deceptive practices that Grubhub uses to exploit its middleman position between kind of restaurants and delivery consumers. Can you just paint a picture of some of the ways that Grubhub has acted towards smaller restaurants to exploit that position, so people can kind of understand the degree of lawlessness in this particular market and the way that it's harmful to restaurants like the ones that you represent in New York?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. And hello, everyone. Yeah, it's been, it's a devastating situation. We've been talking about the Grubhub seamless crisis long before we were in the pandemic crisis, and we've gotten some local legislation passed to address the fees and the bogus charges that Grubhub and Seamless were charging restaurants. I think as was mentioned earlier, restaurants operate on single-digit margins. And when these companies are taking upwards of 30% of each order, they are often taking more money from each order than the restaurant is actually making. So people would say, well, why would a restaurant ever be in a situation like that? And herein lies the problem, is that in a market like New York City, it's estimated that Grubhub and Seamless own, between 60 and 70% of the market share. And Grubhub was the New York City homegrown, or Seamless, homegrown New York City company. And one thing they did early on was with offices. A lot of these companies process a lot of orders for people working in offices. And it used to be, if I was at a law firm or accounting firm, I could, order from a local restaurant if I worked past 6 p.m. and then the company would pay for it. So the company had all these house accounts. And at the end of the month, they'd have to divvy up and pay out 20 different restaurants, and it was also this headache. So the company came in, they said, you know what, we're going to give you one platform. You can basically have your employees order through all of these different restaurants, and you don't have to worry about paying out all these different restaurants. We'll kind of handle the back end accounting for you. And that was one way they really got their hooks in the industry, particularly for restaurants that relied on office workers. But something else they started to do was really try to change consumer behavior and make sure that no matter where the customer orders from, it is going through a Grubhub Seamless channel. So we see that through acquisition of other related companies, but we also saw them set up basically, kind of ghost-like websites. And then they would use SEO and other sophisticated techniques that most everyday restaurateurs don't have, to make sure that if I'm Googling, again, another topic, Andrew's restaurant, that restaurant their website would come up before mine. And of course, they take a big fee, or they set up other phone numbers. So if my phone number is like a 212 zip code, they set up an 866 phone number. And again, use all these techniques to make sure if someone wants to call the restaurant direct, it's going through a Grubhub Seamless channel where they get a fee. And that's what that got them caught up in New York City, because it came out that, wouldn't you know, people call restaurants for reasons other than placing an order. They want to find out, why did their food arrive yet, or they got something wrong, or maybe they're calling about a reservation, or they left their umbrella. So they had some weird algorithm that basically said if you were on the call and it lasted longer than 45 seconds, they would presume an order was made, and then they'd use the average of, I think, the past 6 online orders to charge you a fee. So all these people are calling restaurants, long story short, and restaurants are getting charged upwards thousands, tens of thousands of dollars for phone calls made to the restaurant that didn't even result in an order. And that blew it up. And then we started having city council oversight hearings and basically kept this in the press constantly to get some attention. So I'll leave it there, and I can certainly answer more questions. But it's everything about data. Last thing I'll say on that is, the ownership of data is how they really get a lot of restaurants to stay on their platform, because restaurants know that if they've been on these platforms for years, their customers are used to ordering through those platforms. And if they say, I'm just going to get up and leave Grubhub Seamless, guess what? You lose access to all of that customer data. So you're not in a position to leave the platform. And then you constantly have the reps calling you and saying, hey, if you increase the fees you pay to us, you'll be listed above your competitor. So it's this whole sophisticated platform that they have going on that there's no way restaurants can compete with it. Restaurants live, dollar to dollar, week by week. And these companies, as mentioned earlier, are given the latitude to blow through hundreds of millions of dollars in cash to acquire more market share, to get their teeth into you. And basically all that's left is the restaurant brand, which they've exploited, and they take all the rest of the money. And then they're getting into ghost kitchens, which is a whole other issue that we should be concerned about, because it's the vertical integration that we see in other sectors, and it's happening in restaurants.
Yeah, I want to come back to talk about that a little bit, because I think it's something that folks are just now becoming aware of as another kind of tactic, or the end goal of some of these companies in themselves, which is to replace the restaurant altogether and direct provide food to consumers, like we've seen what, basically what Amazon is doing. Let me ask Katie and Kristen, if I could. I want to ask you guys the same question. You run restaurants. You've been at the front of organizing in your communities for fee caps. I want to get your stories, basically, of how you helped to pass caps in Portland and Las Vegas, the reaction to the delivery app monopolies in those cities, and lessons that you can share for other folks working in other cities on this question. I think we've seen fee caps now passed in 31 cities. Denver just passed one on Monday. I think 3 more are pending. The Protect Our Restaurants campaign that we are running with ILSR and the American Sustainable Business Council and a number of other restaurants and leaders, including yourselves, is intended to help kind of network and bring best practices and lessons forward and together. And I think this is a great opportunity to kind of share what you learned, both with other folks on this call, and then to kind of take to federal policymakers that do really, I think, want to hear these on the ground stories and understand how it's playing out. Kristen, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. Hi, I'm Kristen. One of the founders of Tacotarian, and we're a vegan Mexican restaurant with a couple locations in Las Vegas. So our story is kind of interesting. I actually, when the pandemic hit, we closed for 6 weeks. Because in the beginning you were like, oh my God, are we going to touch something? Is everyone going to get sick? It was very uncertain. So when we reopened, we got PPP money, which we were fortunate. A lot of restaurants didn't get that. And we were only doing takeout and delivery. That was our state mandated order in the beginning. So we were heavily reliant on these apps. And yes, of course, we had used the apps prior to the pandemic, but we were talking about a very low percentage of orders. Now we were just almost 100% of our orders were through these apps. So I saw what Katie was doing, what other people were doing in other cities, and I was like, oh man, that's a great idea. I want to do that here. So I have the, I've previously worked on local legislation for animal welfare, so I kind of had a basic working knowledge of how to get this done, which worked in my benefit. A lot of restaurateurs would have no idea even who to call or where to start, or how to navigate that. So I reached out to, we have a county, a city, and then 2 other cities within the greater Las Vegas area. So our county commission, I had a contact with Tick Segerblom there. So I reached out, and he had no idea about, the predatory practices, how they were charging 30% and all of these things. And so I sent him a bunch of articles, and he said, yeah, let's try to get this done. So I lobbied a bunch of other restaurant owners that were completely fed up with this. And we had like 40 or 50 restaurant owners show up to the meeting that day. And I think the commissioners were like, holy crap, this is insane. So we got it. So there was a lot of discussion about the lawyers for the app show up. They always show up. They send people down to dispute all of the things that we're claiming, to say that they're not doing this. And they want to do like some sort of split, like based on the number of restaurants and all this other nonsense. So what happened was we did an emergency order for a 15% cap. That was supposed to include everything except for credit card processing fees. Now, what happened quickly after is we found that initially none of them were in compliance. After putting some pressure on Postmates, Uber, DoorDash, they fell into compliance. Grubhub refused to comply. They will not comply. What they've done is they've pivoted to claim they're not a delivery company. They are now a marketing company. What they're marketing that's different than any of the other platforms, none of us know. There's no transparency what you're getting for these marketing fees. They claim you can negotiate your marketing fees. You can't. It's a variance of 2%, and you don't know what you get plus or minus that 2%. So now we have to try to go back and amend that ordinance in the county to explicitly explain that it has to include marketing fees. And now Grubhub is lobbying to try to fight us on that because they don't want to comply. And from there, what we've realized is that when we tried to move this, I've been working with the Nevada Restaurant Association. They've been really supportive on this issue. So in working with them and reaching out to the other jurisdictions, meaning North Las Vegas, Henderson, and the city of Las Vegas, which includes the downtown area, is that they actually can't regulate them. We can't pass a cap in those areas because they are not required to have a business license. So let's just think about it for a minute. They are not even required to have a business license. So why do I, this small fry, have to have a business license when these billion-dollar tech companies don't even have to license? Like, we're talking zero regulation. So we cannot even cap them in those jurisdictions until we force a licensing requirement, which will take months because it can't be done in an emergency order like the cap can do. So what I would say to other owners is reach out to people who have already done it and reach out to Economic Liberties because they're facilitating a network of ways that everyone can help you, and make sure that you force business license requirements, that you force what happens if they don't fall into compliance, because we didn't have that in our ordinance. So there was no rule of like what happens if they don't comply, because everyone assumed they would comply. So those are kind of some of the more important things that I found on our journey.
Thanks so much. Oh, I have a visitor. You want to sit with me? I think one thing that we have noticed over the course of this pandemic in particular is we often talk about leveling the playing fields between, big businesses and smaller businesses. And what I think has become crystal clear during the course of this kind of crisis, economic crisis, is that there are like two whole different fields that smaller businesses and larger kind of dominant corporations, especially the tech platforms, play on. And so we need to think about it in that context and put forward kind of structural reforms that both addresses market power and also all of these, kind of wild ways that they exploit loopholes and their army of lobbyists and lawyers to steal money from you, essentially, which is what we see going on. Katie, can I ask you the same question? You've also been a real leader in Portland on this fight. And I think, your insight into how the dynamic has changed over the past year for your business from, pre-pandemic to now, how the platforms are reacting there. And then, I also want to get at what you all want to see going forward, both locally and federally. Because, if regardless, particularly if there's a change of administration, we are going to have to make major policy changes if we want small businesses, not just to come back into a status quo scenario, but to actually have a foundation, an economic foundation, and a set of rules and structures that allow you to thrive and that deal with all of these abuses that we're seeing both in your sector, but also systemically all across the economy. Katie, let me turn it over to you to react to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a journey, to say the least. So at the beginning of the pandemic, just to give a little bit of insight about what we have done in Portland and what we try to do at other jurisdictions outside of Portland. But at the beginning of the pandemic, we all gathered as a group. There's about 50 to 60 business owners in town that met. It was like right before the shutdown. I think it was like March 13th or so. And we identified that the delivery fees were going to be a major issue then. Because I had been working, Hot Yai, which is the restaurant that I run, is fast casual. And we were running with Postmates, UberEats, DoorDash, and Caviar already. And I'd already seen the fees and what sort of effect that had on our P&Ls. And I knew that we needed, and we were paying 25 to 30% of every single order that was coming through those. And I knew that if this issue of a pandemic and a shutdown was coming, that it was only going to get worse, and that most businesses would not have the structure nor the insight to know what to do if they're not going to have 30% of that income coming in. So we started talking about it then. We went through the shutdown. Every single person that we could get in front of, I constantly would bring up, you know, these delivery fees are going to be really burdensome to businesses and may cause them to close because of the lack of income, because of the pandemic. We ended up meeting with a couple of city members and ended up getting into a partnership with Chloe Daly, who was one of our city commissioners, and wrote a bill from, I just grabbed a bunch of all the laws that had been put into place at that time, which I think had been 15 different cities. And we decided to go with 10% commission cap, which was the most aggressive at the time. And we presented the law at the beginning of July, and it was passed unanimously. But in the meantime, the UberEats, DoorDash, and Grubhub all met with our largest chamber of commerce, which is the Portland Business Alliance, and lobbied them to advocate against the cap. So we were dealing with a major, major chamber of commerce. I mean, every single major business in Portland is a member of that commerce, including UberEats. So we were fighting them from the get-go. We knew that we were fighting them from the get-go, but we just started advocating on the side of small business, on the side of equity, which I truly believe this is an equity issue as well, because of small business, minority-owned small businesses, women-owned by small businesses, restaurants, employ, and more, you know, women managers. We can go on and on about the equity issue there. But so we advocated on that side. We were able to get it passed, but we found automatically that Postmates and Grubhub were unwilling to comply. We did have a structure in place to regulate the noncompliance and to punish the noncompliance, but we were not in a place where we could actually, it wasn't automatic. We waited about 3 weeks after the law went through in order to make sure that we could have a reporting system down and that we can actually charge the fees associated to the noncompliance. In the meantime, we met with Postmates lawyers, we met with Grubhub's lawyers, and Grubhub kept trying to advocate, kept railing on, you know, these aren't delivery fees, these are marketing fees, these are marketing fees. But the more that we asked questions about the structure of the marketing fees, it became clearer and clearer that the marketing fees were just bogus. Like they were trying to say that it was anything and everything and nothing at the same time. It was just a number that they would come up with associated to these companies, like what restaurants would sign up with, but it was non-negotiable, just as Kristen said. So Postmates finally came into compliance about a month after, and then Grubhub, after months of litigation with our city lawyers, finally came into compliance in September. And then quickly after that, I actually found our menus on the Grubhub website that had been stolen. So I ended up having to deal with that on my own and going through a series of different phone calls where I spoke to them and asked, you know, point blank, like, how do you stand by these business practices at a time where businesses like mine, and luckily, I mean, I'm informed about these sorts of things because of the work I've done, but have no idea what you're doing and stealing the money that I could potentially be making and taking it for your own. It was very disappointing, but you know, it was super enlightening, and we're excited to be where we're at. But what we fear is, you know, the commission caps expire 90 days after the emergency order is done. So after that, we have nothing. We're going to go right back to the 25 to 30%. We're going to go right back to these multi-million-dollar companies not being regulated at all. So that's where we're at.
Well, we are fighting to make sure that that's not the case. And I think I'm just going to speak for probably everyone on this call that the work that you all are doing, in addition to running your businesses and kind of the organizations that are designed to support them, in the case of Andrew and Colin, is kind of just astonishing. And thank you again for taking the time to talk with us today. Let me ask Andrew, or let me ask Colin one other question, and then I we'll see if we have time for a couple more quick ones. But I think what, like the story and the narrative that Kristen and Katie and Andrew have really clarified is that, you know, these Silicon Valley companies don't care at all about small businesses. A lot of the work that they're doing is PR, right? That they're helping connect small businesses to their customers during the pandemic, but really they're exploiting a huge opportunity to profiteer off of kind of the vulnerability that these businesses are facing at an unprecedented time. Why do you think that is? You know, why do you think that, you know, these corporations are so kind of relentlessly predatory to the point of, you know, stealing menus, setting up fake phone numbers, you know, really kind of it seems like going out of their way to get kind of every last penny, to the point where now I think what we are really seeing, and I think what Congresswoman Scanlon demonstrated, is a snapback against tech in general for the levels of abuse that they've kind of heaped on businesses and consumers, and then kind of democracy on, you know, on the whole, certainly in the case of Facebook, Google, Amazon, and those. What's your, like, what do you think is going on there as someone who's, you know, worked with them and for them in the past?
Yeah, interesting question. Look, I don't think that technology on the whole is predatory, or even Silicon Valley. In my limited time being here, and I'm not originally from here, so you know, I grew up in the Maryland area, and so it has been a little bit of acclimation for me, even during the Grubhub days in Chicago. It was a very different culture. One of the things that's prized here is this idea of disruption, right? And it's a necessary part of evolution of technology, of our country, of our culture, all of these things, right? It's that some of the old elements have to get disrupted in order for new elements to be introduced. The challenge, though, is there's a point where that disruption starts to become exploitation, right? And when you're out here and every company is pushing to disrupt or be more disruptive than the one before, then it becomes really easy to get blurry on where that exploitation line is. And it becomes really easy to normalize against all the other companies in your bubble rather than the rest of the country, right? And the reality is the things that, you know, if you take Zero Storefront, for example, a lot of what we do from a technology standpoint, it's not rocket science. This is not new stuff. This is technology that's been around for at least a decade, right? That's true if you're in the Valley, if you're an engineer, if you're a Stanford MBA, if you have all of these privileges and opportunities, then all these things are like, you know, common sense and you do it every day like it's nothing. If you're like 30% of restaurant owners who are first generation immigrants who speak English as a second language, these are not trivial. These are not, you know, common sense solutions in many ways. And so it's an unfair burden in a lot of ways. And I think that that represents itself in the day by sort of a lack of empathy. You just don't recognize that this is the impact of what you're building on, you know, on Katie, on Kristen, on Andrew's, you know, constituents. And I think there needs to be more of an effort to try and understand that and be a part of that, as opposed to, you know, having to placate the investors and placate, you know, employees who are saying, you know, look, if my shares don't go up in value, I'm going to, you know, the startup across the street. So there's a lot of like other forces that they're balancing. So look, I mean, I've met a lot of the leaders in these companies. I don't think they're genuinely bad people, right? I think they're like good people with good intentions, but are misinformed about maybe the impact of some of their actions like downstream. And so I think it's important for us to help them get informed. It's also important for restaurants to be protecting themselves. Look, there's sort of some blame to go around on both sides, right? It's not, you can't bury your head in the sand and say, okay, I'm not going to change my business. I'm not going to adapt. And these guys need to stop, you know, trying to take advantage of the fact that I'm not adapting. And so there needs to be some meeting in the middle. And one of the things that we try to do with our technologies and solutions, I think, you know, Kristen's doing something really similar, is make what might feel like a mountain from a technology standpoint, from a process standpoint, into something like stairs, or maybe even an escalator at some levels, so that it's more attainable for you to own your customer data, for you to have channels to reach your customer. Look, if there's a pandemic and you don't know any of your customers' contact information, that's a problem, right? If you decide you want to leave Grubhub and you don't have any of your customer list, you don't have any relationship with them, that's a problem, right? So if we can fix some of those things, then it becomes a lot easier for you to look at a platform like Grubhub or DoorDash or Uber Eats and say, I don't like how you're treating me. I'm going somewhere else. And you have the power to be able to do that. And so that's what we spend a lot of time focusing on. And hopefully that'll be helpful in the future.
That's great. Yeah. And I think, what we're seeing too is policymakers start to wake up to the fact that they are actually responsible for making sure that small businesses in their communities are, competing on a level playing field. And we're so far away from that right now. And, they are accountable for that too. And so I think, it's important for folks in the industry to realize that a lot of these corporations, I think now that we're innovators and we're breaking new ground, are now innovating on new ways to exploit the kind of, partners with which they have relationships.
They exploit the exploitation, yeah.
Yeah, whether it's, small businesses or consumers or workers, like it seems like they are on a race to the top for who can find the most innovative ways to exploit the fact that policymakers in the past have really failed to protect other economic actors against, the exploitation of market power and predatory practices like you all are talking about. So I want to ask one more question. I want this to be for Andrew, if I could. I think you mentioned ghost kitchens briefly, but looking around the corner at kind of the next move for a lot of these delivery apps, if they continue to kind of operate in this free-for-all environment, what are ghost kitchens? How do they play into their strategy? What's the risk that they pose to independent restaurants? And how should we be thinking? This is a big question. How should we be thinking about kind of structuring an economic recovery, either kind of at the local community level or at the federal level, that does build kind of a foundation that is different than just going back to a status quo?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's actually somewhat of an extension of what you, Sarah, and Colin were just saying. I mean, listen, delivery is actually a really good thing. And I think there's a big enough market for restaurants and third-party companies that are helping doing these transactions to play in it. But the problem is what do you expect you're going to get if you don't regulate an industry early on? You're going to get all this investment and you're going to get all this exploitation. And ghost kitchens, basically what they are saying is, we know your restaurant isn't built out and optimized for big time delivery and takeout business. So we are going to set up a ghost kitchen, basically an off-site kitchen, and we are going to give you space that you're going to rent to prepare all your delivery food from there, and you can keep it out of your actual full service restaurant, and it basically optimizes your operations. If your restaurant is located in one neighborhood and your delivery zone is only, 30 blocks in either way, you can't deliver 60 blocks, but 60 blocks away, you could set up a ghost kitchen and deliver food locally there. So it sounds like a win for restaurants. And it is in many ways. The problem is you're starting to see the same exact thing that happened in the delivery sector happen with ghost kitchens. Is these ghost kitchens are going to start, they're going to get their teeth into the restaurants. And as they start giving them more business, they're going to use the same basic roadmap. We've seen this before where they're going to say, okay, we're going to increase the rates for you to be here. We could use all the data, own the data. And if I'm Andrew's Burger restaurant, I can look at the burger sale and I can say, okay, this burger does really well. Why don't I start a virtual restaurant that's going to compete with your burgers? And then I'm going to say, if you want to be listed higher than our own company, Ghost Kitchen owned burger place, then you need to pay more. And then they're going to say, you know what? And they're already doing it. Why do you need to hire your staff to prepare your food in our ghost kitchen? You know what? We'll hire or 1099 the people that are going to cook the food, and then they're going to own your labor. They're going to own your delivery channels. Then they're going to say, you know what? We're buying food for all the different ghost kitchens in this restaurant. Why don't we just start our own buying group? And then they're going to get the discounts off the buying. They're not going to pass it on to the restaurants. And then basically what you're going to be left is like a shell of a restaurant concept that some really innovative small business owners started, but it's going to be owned effectively by these big conglomerates. So it's this difficult balance, and maybe it's not that difficult, of saying, Ghost kitchens can be good. Delivery can be good, but we need regulation in place to make a more fair and equitable operating and regulatory environment early on. Otherwise, we're going to see a handful of dominant players come in. And what I've said to all, and I know sometimes it's a different tact than others have, with these third-party delivery companies, I said, listen, I will fight you tooth and nail on all of these issues. But if you want to step up to the table and do the right thing, let's start working together, because I think some of these platforms, they do have good technology. And I think over time, we'll probably see restaurants transition away from just using the big party apps. And there are some other companies where you basically look like it's your own delivery platform, but they're running the software in the back. But you have ownership of your data. Instead of paying a per transaction fee, you're paying a monthly fee. And I think if we can use regulation and our power as small business owners to change the behavior of some of these dominant players, then I think hopefully, we can fix a lot of the problems, but that is not going to happen unless we have government step in and put in fair and equitable regulations for these companies. I mean, it's not that difficult. We know what the problems are. We know what the solutions are. We just need the political will to enact those solutions. And I think if we could have some of them done on a national scale, it may be easier than having not over even every state, but jurisdictions within states start pushing a patchwork of different regulations, because then it gets difficult even for restaurateurs if you have 2 or 3 different places in different neighborhoods where you have different fees and different requirements. So I think we just need to harness the power of the local independent restaurant community, work with our elected officials to get policies in place that stand up to these third parties, that they can't maneuver around with, funny, legal language, which has happened in some of these jurisdictions. And, they're not pulling out of the markets, which they threaten. You know what? And if they do pull out of the market, there's going to be a whole bunch of savvy people out there creating new platforms. So, it will be what it will be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just a great point to end on in general, which is at this point, it really is a question of building political will. And that's partly why we wanted to bring this group together, both to demonstrate with Congresswoman Scanlon at the top that political will is being built in Congress, in regulatory agencies, and thanks to you all at the state and local level. And that we'll kind of continue to be able to do that, hopefully, especially with the framework that was released yesterday out of the House Antitrust Subcommittee.
Can I say one quick last thing?
Absolutely.
Just Colin's point is, and I'm in this thing, I grew up in this business and stuff, so I always can deal with all these different issues and try to give it straight to people in the industry. Don't make it worse and more difficult on yourself than it has to be. Why do you have all the stickers for 20 different delivery platforms that you're on in your windows? Don't promote the other companies, don't say, we're on Grubhub, we're on this. Create your own channel and try to channel everything through your own channels for delivery. So I think, and I'll leave it at that, but I do think there's a lot of practices that restaurateurs can implement that will take some of that power and leverage around away from the third parties without the need for regulation. And I think if we could collectively do that together, that will also go a far way. So we're not completely helpless without regulation. We need it, but there's things we can do as well.
Thanks so much. Kristen, Katie, can I offer you any last words to our audience?
Yeah, I just want to kind of follow up on what Andrew and Colin both touched on. I think the 3 things that need to happen for restaurant owners now is education, meaning educating your customer, really letting the customer know hey, we're taking a hit. Because when we started doing that and transitioning to our own ordering system, we saw a huge drop in third-party platform use because the customer literally has no idea that we're getting charged 30%. So when you tell them that, your loyal customers are going to transition on their own. So that's number 1. Using other forms of, I was shocked how many restaurants when the pandemic hit did not have their own online ordering system. It was mind-blowing. So creating your own online ordering system. And then mobilizing, working together, which is what you guys are doing at Economic Liberties Project, bringing us all together to mobilize to make our industry better and then working to regulate and investigate. These guys need to be investigated. So I think that's where we need to go from here. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And I'm going to just echo that with Kristen, is that, like, you know, it was the moment in which our restaurants came together and used our collective voice that really pushed this issue forward. And we actually, when Grubhub was going through the process of not complying and not showing any will to comply, we actually called for a Grubhub boycott. And Grubhub is still struggling to get a hold back in Portland because of the boycott, because of the transparency that we pushed through, and the insistence that they be an equal partner, because this is what we expect business partners to be business partners. If you're not going to be a partner, then you don't have any place in this community, and you're not going to be uplifting our local businesses, which means you're not going to be uplifting our community in general. So you know, if you have the ability and the will to do that, go for it, and use us as resources if you need to, because it is a little bit of a detail-oriented fight going through that process.
Sarah, just to add one last thing to Katie's point. Look, restaurant owners are strong people. Like, this is not a weak group. This is, many of the people who run these organizations have been fighting their whole lives. And so, like, this is not a fight that I think we need to back down from. I think in many cases, though, you've got to seek the help, whether it's on the technology side, whether it's on the policy side, whether it's on the strategy side. You've got, you know, 5 faces here that are willing to help. I've got a whole team of engineers and really smart people. All we do is sit around all day figuring out how to help restaurants take back that power. Seek the help. We are here to do it. In fact, we just got an investment from Google that's literally just for us to retire SaaS fees for restaurants to be able to help them come out of this thing stronger than they went into it. So ask for the help. It's there. And so we got a lot of great people who are willing to do it and go to bat for you.
Winston Churchill said, don't let a good crisis go to waste, or something like that. So let's use this crisis to make sure that we're able to change a lot of things. And one of the things is the relationship between restaurants and third-party delivery.
Amazing. I think that is a great set of last words. And I appreciate the partnership and the leadership that you all are showing. It's just so inspiring. It feels like you must have 48 hours in every day to do all that you're doing. And it probably feels like that too. So thank you so much for spending 40 minutes with us this afternoon, I guess, to talk through this, to help educate folks in Washington who care about small businesses, who want to rein in monopolies, and who want to hear from you for guidance and insight on how we can do that. So with that, thanks everyone, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.